The words landed softly, almost casually, which somehow made them worse. I only married her because she needed someone, my husband said, lifting his glass with a lazy smile. Let's be honest, at her age, nobody else was lining up. Laughter rippled around the table. Not shocked laughter, not uncomfortable laughter, real laughter, the kind that settles in the chest and feels earned. I sat there, perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my spine straight. 50 years old, 10 years married, and reduced to a punchline over grilled salmon and expensive wine. Please like this video, listen to my story, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Renee Thompson, and that was the night my life split cleanly into before and after. We were at my husband's friend's birthday dinner at a polished restaurant downtown, all exposed brick and warm lighting, the kind of place that prides itself on intimacy. Couples leaned close to one another. Forks clinked against plates. Jazz hummed low in the background. A beautiful setting for something ugly. My husband, Marcus, had been drinking. Not sloppy drunk. Never that. Just enough to feel bold. Just enough to say the things he usually kept wrapped in sarcasm or silence. Someone had joked about relationships lasting through middle age. Another woman at the table, early 40s, glowing, confident, had laughed and said, "Marriage after 40 takes bravery." Marcus snorted. That's one word for it. And then he said what he said. I felt eyes slide toward me. Curious, measuring, pitying. I smiled. Not because I found it funny. Not because it didn't hurt. But because Black women learn early how to survive rooms that turn cold without warning. We learn to stay composed, to not give people the satisfaction of watching us break. I lifted my napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and placed it carefully on the table. "Excuse me," I said calmly. "Restroom." Marcus didn't look at me. He was already moving on, already telling another story, already reclaiming the room. The bathroom was empty, bright, clean. I locked myself into a stall, then leaned back against the wall and exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if I were trying to stop my heart from making a sound. I didn't cry. Instead, I stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. 50 years old, deep brown skin lined with laughter I had earned and stress I hadn't deserved. Silver threading my curls at the temples, eyes that had seen too much and still shown up anyway. I had built a life before Marcus, a good one. I had worked for everything, my career, my home, my independence. I had raised myself when no one else could. I had survived things that never made it into polite conversation. And for 10 years, I had been slowly shrinking inside a marriage that demanded gratitude instead of respect. I pressed my palms into the cool marble counter and steadied myself. This wasn't the first time he'd embarrassed me, just the first time he'd done it so publicly, so proudly. I thought about the small moments I had explained away, the jokes about my age, the comments about how lucky I was he'd committed, the way he liked to remind people, especially other men, that he was the one who stepped up. As if love were charity, as if I were something rescued instead of chosen. I reached into my purse and touched the smooth wooden bead bracelet I always carried, something my aunt had given me years ago. "Never forget who you were before someone told you who to be," she'd said. At the table, the laughter rose again. I straightened my shoulders, unlocked the stall, and walked back out. Marcus glanced up when I returned. He smiled at me the way men smile when they believe they've won. "You okay, babe?" he asked lightly. I met his eyes. "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it because in that moment something inside me went quiet. Not numb, clear. I sat down, lifted my glass, and took a slow sip. They thought the moment had passed. They didn't know it had just begun. Before Marcus, my life was already full. Not loud, not flashy, but solid. At 40, I had my routines, my people, my peace. I owned my small townhouse on the south side outright. The mortgage paid off 2 years early. I worked in community outreach, long days, emotional days, but work that mattered. On weekends, I took long walks, went to book clubs, met friends for brunch, called my mother every Sunday without fail. I wasn't lonely. I was alone sometimes. Yes, but there is a difference. One I understood well. Marcus came into my life when I wasn't looking to be saved. We met at a charity fundraiser a mutual friend had dragged me to. I remember standing near the drink table, debating whether to leave early when he appeared beside me with an easy smile and a quiet confidence that felt refreshing. He was a few years younger, well-dressed, articulate. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. "You don't seem like you enjoy crowds," he said. "I enjoy purpose," I replied. "Crowds are optional." He laughed at that. Not at me, but with me. At least, that's how it felt then. Marcus talked about stability, about wanting something real. He said he was tired of games, tired of women who didn't know what they wanted. When I told him my age, he nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "You know yourself." I mistook that for respect. In the beginning, he made me feel chosen. Not rushed, not pressured, just selected, like someone who had surveyed the chaos of the dating world and decided I was the calm harbor. He admired my independence, or so he said. "You've got it together," he'd tell people. I liked that about her. But slowly, admiration turned into commentary. He'd tease me about being set in my ways, about not needing anyone, about being used to doing things alone. At first, I laughed along. It seemed harmless, playful, even. When he moved into my townhouse a year later, he joked about how it must feel finally having someone to share the load with. "You've been carrying everything yourself for so long," he said. "Let me take care of you now." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that after decades of self-reliance, I was allowed to rest. We married 2 years after we met. Small ceremony, close friends, family, nothing extravagant. Marcus insisted on vows that spoke about loyalty and gratitude. I didn't think much of it then. Gratitude sounded like appreciation. I didn't hear the imbalance hiding underneath. After the wedding, the tone shifted in small ways. When I paid for something, he'd say, "See, this is why I tell people you're a blessing." When I handled a problem, he'd smile and say, "I don't know what I'd do without you." It sounded like praise. It felt like pressure. If I got tired, he'd remind me I was strong. If I expressed frustration, he'd call me sensitive. If I pulled away, he'd joke, "Don't forget, I chose you." That one stayed with me. Chose. As if love were an act of generosity instead of partnership. Still, I adjusted. Quietly. I explained less. I swallowed things that didn't sit right, because the world loves to whisper that compromise is the price of companionship. And I was tired of being asked why I was single. Marcus never raised his voice. He never hit me. He never openly insulted me, not until the night at the restaurant. But erosion doesn't need force. It just needs time. By the time I turned 50, I had learned to make myself smaller without realizing I was doing it. And that, I now understand, is how the real damage begins. Somewhere between our 4th and 7th year of marriage, the balance shifted. Not suddenly, not loudly. There was no argument I could point to and say, "That's when it happened." It was quieter than that. More ordinary. The kind of change that sneaks in while you're busy living. Marcus stopped talking about us as something we were building and started talking about it as something already built, something stable enough for him to lean on. Hard. At first, it looked like trust. He let me handle things. Bills, appointments, planning, decisions. He'd say, "You're better at that stuff," as if efficiency were a compliment instead of a burden. When I reminded him of deadlines or responsibilities, he'd smile and say, "See, that's why I married you." I told myself that was partnership, but partnership doesn't feel one-sided. By year 5, my salary carried most of our lifestyle. Marcus always had an explanation: market conditions, office politics, being underappreciated. He wasn't unemployed, but he was perpetually in transition, always preparing for something better that never quite arrived. If I asked questions, he accused me of doubting him. If you believed in me, he'd say, "You wouldn't sound like that." So I softened my voice, changed my phrasing, learned how to bring things up in ways that wouldn't trigger defensiveness. I became fluent in reassurance. Meanwhile, my days grew heavier. I worked full weeks, came home, cooked dinner, handled paperwork, remembered birthdays, kept track of family obligations, mine and his. When I was exhausted, Marcus would hug me and say, "I don't know how you do it." He never asked how to help. When I asked him for more emotional presence, he framed it as criticism. "You're never satisfied." He'd say, "Nothing I do is enough for you." That one always stopped me cold, because I wasn't asking for more. I was asking for equal. But equal sounded selfish when spoken out loud. By year 6, his jokes had changed. In front of friends, he'd say things like, "Renee runs the house," or "I just show up and enjoy the ride." People laughed. I laughed too, even though something inside me tightened every time. At home, if I mentioned being overwhelmed, he'd shrug. "You're strong. You've always been strong." Strength became my cage. I noticed how often I apologized. For my tone, for my timing, for being tired, for wanting rest, for needing space. Marcus never apologized unless it was followed by a justification. "I'm sorry you feel that way," but always erased the apology. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was asking too much, if I'd grown rigid with age, if this was just how marriages looked after a decade. I watched other couples carefully, tried to compare, tried to normalize. Still, there were moments, small, piercing ones that cut through the fog. Like the night I came home sick, feverish, barely able to stand. Marcus looked up from the couch and said, "What's for dinner?" Or the time he introduced me at a work event as the woman who keeps my life together, then laughed like it was a compliment. Or the way he'd get quiet whenever I succeeded at something, then later find a way to remind me that success didn't make me easy to live with. "You're intimidating," he once told me. "You know that, right?" I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how being capable had turned into something I needed to apologize for. By my 48th birthday, I felt older than my years. Not in my body, but in my spirit, like I had been holding my breath for too long. I still loved Marcus. Or maybe I loved the idea of what we were supposed to be. But deep down, I began to sense something I didn't want to name yet. I wasn't his partner. I was his foundation. And foundations aren't meant to be thanked. They're meant to be stood on. Loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from being unheard for so long that you stop trying to speak. By the 8th year of our marriage, I realized Marcus no longer looked at me when I talked. Not fully. His eyes would drift to his phone, the television, the window, anywhere but my face. I'd be mid-sentence, explaining something that mattered to me, and he'd nod without listening. At first, I'd repeat myself. Then, I'd shorten my thoughts. Eventually, I stopped sharing altogether. When I came home tired, Marcus noticed, but not in the way I needed. He'd say things like, you should smile more, or you used to be more fun, as if joy were something I had misplaced out of carelessness. If I mentioned feeling lonely, he'd sigh, "You're always so heavy, Renee." Heavy, as though my emotions were weights dragging him down instead of signals asking to be held. I began to censor myself. I learned which versions of me were acceptable: the agreeable one, the quiet one, the competent one, the one who didn't ask questions that made him uncomfortable, the one who didn't expect tenderness after a long day. When I did try to talk, really talk, Marcus framed it as conflict. "Why do you always want to turn everything into a problem?" I started to wonder if maybe I did. I watched myself from a distance sometimes, saw how quickly I dismissed my own needs, how often I told myself it's not that bad, how I measured my unhappiness against imaginary women who had it worse. He doesn't cheat. He doesn't hit me. He provides. Sometimes. I told myself I was lucky, but luck shouldn't feel like suffocation. At gatherings, Marcus had a way of joking about me that made people laugh while leaving me strangely exposed. "She's the serious one," he'd say. "I bring the fun." Or worse, "She keeps me in line." People smiled, nodded. I smiled too. Inside, something wilted. At home, the jokes sharpened. "You don't need romance, you need a nap." "No wonder men are scared of you." "Lighten up." "I'm kidding." Every time I flinched, he accused me of lacking humor. "See, this is why I can't talk to you." And I would apologize. I apologized for my tone, for my timing, for my feelings. One night, I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection, and realized I hadn't laughed freely in months. Not the deep, unguarded kind, the kind that reaches your eyes. I didn't know when I'd lost it. There were nights I lay beside Marcus, the space between us wide despite the mattress touching both our bodies. He'd fall asleep quickly. I'd stay awake, listening to his breathing, wondering how two people could share a life and still feel like strangers. I tried to fix it. Of course I did. I suggested counseling. He scoffed. "So now I'm broken?" I tried date nights. He forgot. I tried giving him space. He called me distant. Every adjustment was mine to make. By year 9, I felt invisible in my own home. Not abused, not abandoned, just erased. I still showed up, still cooked, still paid, still smiled in public, still held everything together. But there was a quiet grief settling into my bones, the grief of knowing that the person who claimed to love you had stopped seeing you entirely. The worst part wasn't his indifference. It was how familiar it had become. And somewhere deep inside, a thought began to form, soft at first, barely audible. "This isn't love." I didn't say it out loud. Not yet. But once a truth enters you, it doesn't leave. It waits. By the time the invitations started arriving, I already felt tired. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of tired that settles behind your eyes and makes even small decisions feel heavy. Marcus had become more social in recent years, more eager to be seen. He liked rooms where people laughed at his stories, where his charm landed easily. I went along because that's what wives did, because it was easier than explaining why I didn't want to. At gatherings, I began to notice how he positioned himself. Never quite beside me, always half a step ahead. He'd speak for us instead of with us. "We're good," he'd say when people asked how married life was. Not "I'm good," not "she's good." "We're good." It sounded inclusive. It wasn't. I felt like an accessory, something that confirmed his stability, proof that he was a man with his life together. And I was careful with my expressions, my words, my reactions. I knew how easily a moment could turn, how a joke could land sideways, how a single raised eyebrow could become attitude. Marcus had started making comments in public that he used to save for home. The night of the dinner, the one I would replay in my head again and again, began like any other. Marcus told me it was important. Someone's birthday, good networking, good food. Just relax, he said as we drove downtown. You don't have to analyze everything. I hadn't said a word. The restaurant was beautiful, intimate, low lighting, the kind of place where conversations feel closer than they should. We were seated at a long table with couples and acquaintances I barely knew. Everyone seemed polished, confident, at ease. I felt like I was holding my breath. Marcus was in his element. He told stories, made people laugh, ordered wine without asking what I wanted. When I tried to join the conversation, he interrupted me gently, just enough to redirect attention back to himself. As the evening went on, the jokes grew bolder, less affectionate, more revealing. I watched his face, saw the way he leaned into the attention, the way his voice lifted when people laughed. I felt exposed, like I was standing under a spotlight I hadn't agreed to. A woman across the table mentioned marriage, said something about growing together as you age. The conversation shifted, naturally, the way these things do. Marcus laughed first. I felt it before he spoke, a tightening in my chest, a warning my body had learned well. Then he said it, and the room changed. I didn't react right away. That surprised even me. It was as if my mind stepped back, watching from a distance while my body stayed still. I registered the laughter, the glances, the way no one challenged him. That's when I understood something crucial. This wasn't an accident. This was comfort. He felt safe enough to say it, confident enough that I wouldn't correct him, that I'd do what I always did, absorb the moment and carry it quietly. When I excused myself, no one followed. No one asked if I was okay. Not even Marcus. In the bathroom, staring at myself, I realized I had crossed an invisible line. The room wasn't safe anymore. Not for my dignity, not for my silence, not for the version of myself I had been trying so hard to maintain. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with clarity I hadn't felt in years. I could not unhear what he said, and I could not unknow what it revealed. Something had broken open, and it wasn't going to close again. The drive home was quiet, not the comfortable kind, not the kind built on shared understanding. It was the heavy, suspended silence of something unresolved, something neither of us was ready to name. Marcus drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually on his thigh. He hummed along to the radio. I watched the streetlights blur past the window and focused on breathing evenly. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I was just joking back there. He said, finally, eyes still on the road. You know how people are. They take things too seriously. I waited. He glanced at me, then back at the windshield. You could have laughed it off, he added, made it less awkward. There it was. Not an apology, not concern, just expectation. I nodded once. Okay, I said. The word surprised him. He seemed to relax, as if the moment had been successfully folded away. He turned the music up a notch. At home, he kicked off his shoes and headed straight for the kitchen, opening the fridge. You hungry? He asked. I shook my head. He shrugged, grabbed a drink, and disappeared into the living room. The television came on. Laughter from a sitcom filled the space. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, still wearing my coat, listening. 10 years. And this was how it ended, with him assuming I would swallow it like everything else. I changed clothes slowly, deliberately, folded the dress, placed my shoes neatly in the closet. Every movement felt precise, intentional, as if I were grounding myself in the physical world to keep from floating away. When I joined him on the couch, he glanced at me briefly. You good now? He asked. Yes, I said again. He leaned back, satisfied. I watched his face as the show played. The way he laughed freely, unburdened, untouched by the night. I realized something then that settled into me with eerie calm. He wasn't worried, not about hurting me, not about crossing a line, not about consequences. He believed deeply that I would absorb it, that I always would. That belief had been earned. Later, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling while he slept. His breathing was steady, familiar. I felt oddly detached, as if I were observing someone else's life. I replayed the laughter at the table, the way his words had landed and stayed, the way no one had defended me, not even myself. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain it away. I didn't tell myself he didn't mean it. I didn't blame the alcohol. I didn't search for my own fault. I simply let it be what it was, a truth. In the days that followed, Marcus acted as though nothing had happened. He joked. He teased. He touched my shoulder absent-mindedly. He expected normal, and I gave it to him. But something in me had shifted. I stopped filling the silence, stopped offering reassurance, stopped smoothing edges. I listened more than I spoke. I watched him carefully, not with hope, but with clarity. I noticed how often he spoke over me, how quickly he dismissed discomfort, how naturally he took. I began to see patterns where I'd once seen problems. One evening, as he complained about work, he said, "At least I know you've got my back." I smiled faintly. Yes, I said, but inside, a decision had formed, quiet, firm, irreversible. I would no longer protect his image at the expense of my dignity. I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I simply stopped covering for him. And for the first time in years, I slept deeply. Not because things were better, but because I was finally awake, or so I thought. Marcus noticed before I said a word. Not because I announced a change, but because I stopped accommodating him. I didn't rush home anymore. I didn't rearrange my schedule to fit his last-minute plans. When he talked, I listened without interruption, without agreement, without the familiar cushioning of reassurance. I answered questions plainly, briefly, and that unsettled him. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening, watching me from across the kitchen. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. He frowned. That's it. Silence stretched between us. Not tense, just present. Marcus shifted his weight. "You're acting different." I looked at him then. Really looked. The impatience behind his concern. The way his jaw tightened when he didn't get the response he expected. "I'm tired," I said calmly. He scoffed. "You're always tired." Once, that comment would have stung. This time, it landed and slid off. I stopped volunteering information about my day, stopped narrating my thoughts. I spent evenings reading, walking, sitting with myself. I went to bed when I was tired instead of waiting for him. I woke up early and left the house quietly. I reclaimed small pockets of space. Marcus grew restless. "You don't talk to me anymore," he accused one night. "I talk," I said. "I just don't explain." That bothered him more than anger ever had. He began testing me. Small digs, familiar jokes, moments designed to provoke reaction. When I didn't bite, he pushed harder. "So what? You're too good for conversation now." I met his eyes. "No, then what is it?" "I'm listening," I said. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. "You're being dramatic." I let the word hang in the air. That was new too, letting things hang. He started complaining that I was cold, distant, changed. He asked if I was mad, asked if I was holding a grudge, asked if I was trying to punish him. I answered none of it, because for the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was observing. I noticed how uncomfortable he became without my emotional labor, how quickly he grew irritable when I didn't smooth things over, how often he reached for control once reassurance disappeared. One night he snapped. "What do you want from me, Renee?" he demanded. "You've been walking around like I don't exist." I set down my book. "I exist," I said. "That's new for you." His eyes narrowed. "Don't start." "I didn't," I replied. "You did." He stared at me, searching for the old version of me, the one who softened, who apologized, who backtracked. She wasn't there. "This attitude," he said finally, "it's not attractive." There it was, the familiar threat. Once I would have panicked, would have tried to explain, to reassure, to fix. Instead, I felt steady. "That's okay," I said quietly. He blinked. "What? If you don't like me," I continued, "you don't have to." The room went very still. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't used to that response. He wasn't used to a woman who didn't fear his approval. "You're being ridiculous," he muttered, turning away. "Maybe," but as I watched him retreat into himself, I realized something fundamental had changed. His disapproval no longer scared me. His silence no longer felt like punishment, and his opinion, once the loudest voice in my head, had finally lost its power. For the first time in 10 years, I felt tall again. Not loud, not angry, just unmoved. And that, I understood, was what frightened him most. On a Tuesday morning, I almost deleted it. It looked like one of those generic alerts, polite subject line, clean formatting, important update regarding your credit activity. I hovered over it while sipping my coffee, half listening to the news playing softly in the background. I hadn't missed any payments. I paid everything on time. I was meticulous about that. Always had been. Still, something made me click. The screen refreshed, and within seconds, the quiet order of my morning fractured. There were accounts I didn't recognize. Not one. 3. A credit card opened 18 months earlier. Another 9 months after that. A personal line of credit I had never applied for, carrying a balance large enough to make my chest tighten. All in my name. My hands went cold. I read the numbers again. Slowly, carefully. I checked the dates, the addresses, the linked accounts, our address. My chair scraped loudly against the floor as I stood. I paced the kitchen, phone in hand, my mind racing but strangely clear. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't error. This was real. I called the bank, verified my identity, asked questions I already knew the answers to. The representative was calm, professional, apologetic. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson, these accounts were opened using your credit profile. Were there any co-signers?" I asked. A pause. Keyboard clicking. "No, ma'am." I sat down hard. By the time Marcus came home that evening, I had printed everything. Statements, dates, payment histories, missed payments I'd never been notified about because the email address on file wasn't mine. He walked in whistling, loosened his tie, glanced at the papers on the table. "What's all this?" he asked casually. I didn't answer right away. "Marcus," I said evenly, "why are there 3 credit accounts in my name that I didn't open?" He froze, just for a second, barely noticeable. Then he laughed. "Are you serious?" he said. "You scared me. I thought something was wrong." "Something was wrong. You opened them," I said. He shrugged. "We're married." That was it. No denial, no apology, just entitlement. "You used my credit." I continued, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Without telling me. It's not like I was hiding it." He snapped. "You handle the finances anyway." I stared at him. "You routed the bills to an email I don't have." "So," he said, "I didn't want to stress you out." I let out a slow breath. You missed payments. Once or twice, he said dismissively. It's not the end of the world. My credit score told a different story. You let my name carry your debt, I said, while you stood in rooms joking about how you chose me. His face hardened. You're making this a bigger deal than it is. I laughed then. One sharp sound. You used me, I said, financially, legally, quietly. He crossed his arms. Everything I did was for us. No, I replied. It was for you. Silence fell between us, thick, undeniable. You wouldn't even have those limits if it weren't for me, he muttered. That sentence landed heavier than all the rest. He hadn't borrowed from me. He had extracted from me. I gathered the papers slowly, my movements deliberate. This ends, I said. Now. He scoffed. You're overreacting. I looked at him, really looked, and felt something final settle into place. This wasn't love gone wrong. This wasn't miscommunication. This was exploitation, dressed up as marriage. That night, lying alone in bed, I didn't cry. I felt focused. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the truth I could no longer avoid. Marcus hadn't just humiliated me. He had built his life on my back, and I was done carrying him. I didn't tell Marcus what I was doing. There was no announcement, no argument, no dramatic exit. I had learned enough to know that information in his hands became leverage. So I moved quietly. The morning after our confrontation, I left the house early and drove to work like any other day. Same route, same coffee stop, same posture. Nothing about me signaled alarm. Inside, everything was shifting. During lunch, I locked myself in my office and made the calls. Credit bureaus first. I froze everything. Accounts I didn't recognize were flagged. Passwords were changed. Security questions updated with answers only I would know. Each step grounded me further. I opened a new checking account in my name alone, redirected my paycheck, set alerts on every transaction. I printed statements and stored them in a folder I kept at work, not home. Evidence matters. When I got home that evening, Marcus was waiting. You didn't answer my texts, he said. I was busy, I replied. He watched me carefully now, like someone sensing a storm without knowing where it would hit. You're still mad, he said. I'm focused. I corrected. That irritated him. He followed me into the kitchen. You're acting like I did something unforgivable. I poured myself a glass of water. You did. He laughed sharply. You froze the accounts, didn't you? I didn't respond. That's controlling, he snapped. You're punishing me. I met his gaze. I'm protecting myself. His face darkened. Don't forget, he said slowly, we're married. You can't just shut me out. I felt the old reflex rise, the urge to soothe, to explain, to compromise. I ignored it. I said, and I am. He stormed off, slamming the bedroom door. I sat at the table and finished my water. Later that night, he tried a different approach. I was under a lot of pressure, he said softly, sitting beside me. You know how hard things have been for me. I waited. I did it because I trusted you, he continued, because we're a team. No, I said quietly. You did it because you assumed I wouldn't stop you. He stood abruptly. So what, you're just going to throw 10 years away? I looked up at him. You did that. He scoffed. You think you're so perfect. I think I'm done being used. That was the moment his anger sharpened. You'd be nothing without me, he said. You know that, right? The words echoed in the room. I thought of the townhouse I'd owned before him, the career I'd built, the credit he'd quietly drained. I smiled faintly. That's not true. He stared at me, realizing he no longer had the effect he wanted. Over the next few days, I gathered documents. marriage certificate, financial records, account histories. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney during my lunch break and paid the fee from my new account. Sitting in that office, explaining my situation out loud, I felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time, someone listened without minimizing, without reframing, without asking me to be smaller. At night, lying alone on my side of the bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt fear flicker briefly, then fade. I wasn't trapped. I had options. And for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something happening to me. It felt like something I was about to choose. Marcus stopped pretending by the end of the week. At first, he cycled through moods quickly: quiet resentment in the mornings, forced charm in the evenings, sudden flashes of irritation when I didn't respond the way I used to. It was like watching someone test doors that no longer opened. He paced the house, muttering under his breath. He accused me of plotting, of turning people against him, of exaggerating what he'd done. "You're acting like I robbed you," he said, "like I'm some kind of criminal. You used my identity without my consent." I replied, "That has a name." He slammed his hand against the wall. "You're enjoying this." I paused, then faced him. "Enjoying what?" "Playing the victim," he said, finally having leverage. The irony almost made me laugh. He tried guilt next. "I stood by you," he said one evening, voice low and deliberate, "when you were older, when men weren't exactly lining up." There it was again. The same sentence, sharpened. "I chose you," he continued. "You should remember that." I felt something click into place, clean and final. "You didn't choose me," I said. "You found someone stable and decided you were entitled to her." His eyes flashed. "Watch your mouth." I didn't raise my voice. "Or what?" He stepped closer. Too close. For a moment, I saw it clearly, not rage, but panic. A man realizing the structure he'd leaned on was no longer supporting his weight. "You think you can just walk away?" he said. "You think anyone's going to want you at 50? That was the line. Not because it hurt, but because it confirmed everything. I looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing but certainty. "This conversation is over," I said. He laughed bitterly. "You don't get to decide that." "I do now." That night, he slept on the couch by choice, or pride. I didn't ask. I locked the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly. There was no grief, no longing, just resolve. I thought about the woman I had been 10 years ago, the way I'd mistaken tolerance for love, the way I'd accepted crumbs because they were offered with charm. I thought about the restaurant, the laughter, the bills, the entitlement, and I understood something fully for the first time. Marcus didn't love me. He relied on me. And when reliance is threatened, it turns ugly. The next morning, I left early, not to run, but to prepare. The attorney's office smelled faintly of coffee and paper. I sat upright in the chair across from her desk, my folder resting neatly on my lap. Statements, timelines, notes, evidence of 10 years I was finally allowing myself to examine without excuse. She flipped through the pages, quietly, nodding now and then. "This part," she said, tapping one sheet where the accounts were opened in your name. "Did he ever do this before? With anyone else?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know," I said honestly. "He said I was different." She gave me a look, not unkind, but knowing. "I ask," she said carefully, "because I've seen this pattern before. Often." Something tightened in my chest. "Pattern," I repeated. She leaned back slightly. "Men who rely on a partner's credit, stability, emotional labor, they usually don't start with the first woman who lets them." I was quiet for a long moment. After the meeting, I didn't go straight home. I sat in my car in the parking lot, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. Her words echoed, not accusatory, not dramatic, just factual. A pattern. That evening, as I packed a small suitcase to leave the house, I found the box. It was shoved to the back of the hall closet beneath old coats and unused shoes, well hidden in plain sight. I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. Inside were documents Marcus had never bothered to organize. Old mail, expired IDs, a folded court paper with a different woman's name on it. I sat on the floor and unfolded it carefully. A civil judgment, credit-related. The dates lined up with a time Marcus had once described as a bad breakup. My stomach dropped, not from shock, but from recognition. I remembered how he talked about her. She was unstable, bad with money, always blaming him for her problems. I had nodded then, believed him. I picked up my phone and searched her name. It didn't take long. Public records told a quiet story. Debt, a lawsuit, a settlement, and then nothing. No social media, no trace, like someone who had disappeared after being drained dry. When Marcus came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table. The document lay between us. Who is she? I asked calmly. He glanced at the paper, then rolled his eyes. Why are you digging into my past? Answer the question. He sighed dramatically. An ex-ancient history. You did this to her, I said. He laughed. You don't know what you're talking about. You used her credit. I continued. You framed yourself as the one who helped her, and when she collapsed under it, you walked away. That's not what happened, he snapped. She was reckless. The words sounded familiar. She couldn't handle things, he went on. I tried to help. I felt something settle, solid and heavy. You didn't change, I said. You just upgraded. His face hardened. Don't flatter yourself. I'm not, I replied. I'm understanding. He stepped closer. You're really going to believe some paperwork over your own husband? Yes, I said without hesitation, because the truth was no longer emotional. It was documented. You think you're so special, he muttered. You're just like her. I stood. No, I said, I'm the one who stopped it. I zipped my bag, slowly, deliberately. Each movement felt ceremonial. This ends now, I said, with me. He scoffed. You'll regret this. I picked up my keys. I paused at the door, not to look back at him, but to look at the space I was leaving. 10 years. Lessons learned the hardest way. It was never just me. I said quietly, and that's why you don't scare me anymore. I stepped outside. The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I was walking out of a pattern that would not get to claim another woman through me. The apartment, I moved to quiet in a way I wasn't used to. Not empty, not lonely, just still. The first night, I sat on the edge of the borrowed bed. Neutral sheets, unfamiliar lamp, a single chair by the window, and listened to the silence settle around me. No television humming in the background. No footsteps pacing the hallway. No voice waiting to fill the air. I slept with the light on, not out of fear, out of adjustment. In the morning, I woke before my alarm and lay there for a moment, confused by the absence of tension in my chest. For years, my body had learned to brace itself before my mind even caught up. Now, there was nothing to brace for. Relief came in waves. So did grief. I missed the routine more than the man. The habit of shared space. The illusion of partnership. The version of myself who believed endurance was love. Marcus tried to reach me on the second day. 1 text, then 3, then a voicemail. His voice was calm at first, reasonable, even. We need to talk this out like adults. By the 3rd message, the edge crept back in. You're overreacting. You're embarrassing me. This doesn't have to get ugly. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing him, but because I had nothing left to explain. I blocked his number that evening. The days passed gently. I went to work. I took walks. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired. I noticed how often I checked my phone out of habit, then stopped. No one was waiting on me, and that felt unfamiliar. One evening, sitting by the window, I realized I was breathing differently, deeper, freer, as if my lungs had more room now. There were moments when anger flared unexpectedly, memories replaying themselves, now stripped of excuses. Things I had dismissed, words I had swallowed. I let the anger pass through me without judgment. It wasn't there to consume me. It was there to inform me. I thought about the other woman, the one before me, the one who hadn't stopped it. I wondered where she was now, whether she'd rebuilt, whether she ever blamed herself. I hoped she hadn't. Marcus sent one final message through an email address I hadn't blocked yet. You'll regret this. I read it once. For the first time, regret didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something I had already avoided. That night, I turned off the light before sleeping. The darkness didn't frighten me. It held me. And as I drifted off, I understood something quietly without ceremony. I was no longer surviving the aftermath of a marriage. I was standing at the beginning of a life that belonged fully to me. The conference room was small, bright, and unremarkable. That was fitting. Nothing about the process felt dramatic. No raised voices. No slammed doors. Just paperwork, timelines, and facts laid out cleanly on the table. For the first time, the story was being told without emotion attached to it. And that changed everything. I sat beside my attorney, hands folded, listening as she spoke. She didn't soften language. She didn't speculate. She didn't protect Marcus's feelings. She stated what happened. Unauthorized accounts, financial misuse, patterned behavior. The words landed with weight because they were documented. Marcus sat across the table, stiff-backed, jaw clenched. He looked smaller somehow, not because he was being attacked, but because he was being seen clearly. When it was his turn to speak, he tried to charm the room. I never meant any harm, he said. We were married. Things got misunderstood. No one nodded. He tried indignation next. She's exaggerating, he said, gesturing toward me. She's emotional. My attorney didn't react. She is factual, she replied calmly. That distinction mattered. For years, I had been the emotional one, the sensitive one, the difficult one. Now, I was simply accurate. As the meeting went on, the narrative Marcus relied on began to crumble. There were questions he couldn't answer, dates he couldn't explain, accounts he'd assumed no one would trace back to him. I watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This wasn't punishment. This was consequence. When the meeting ended, Marcus tried to corner me in the hallway. You didn't have to do all this, he said under his breath. You're making me look bad. I met his eyes. You did that, I said. I just stopped covering for you. He scoffed. You think this makes you strong? I considered the question. No, I said. This shows that I always was. I walked past him without another word. Later that evening, sitting alone in my temporary apartment, I reviewed the next steps. Asset separation, debt responsibility, timelines. Each item represented a piece of myself I was reclaiming. I felt no urge to rush. Strength didn't need speed. Friends began to reach out, some who knew more than I realized, others who sensed something had changed. I didn't overshare. I didn't justify. I'm moving forward, I said simply. That was enough. One night, as I stood by the window watching the city lights, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked familiar, not younger, not unscarred, but aligned. I thought about the woman at the restaurant table, the one who smiled through humiliation, the one who folded herself to maintain peace. She hadn't been weak. She had been enduring something she no longer needed to endure. And endurance, I had learned, is not the same as living. I picked up my bracelet and slid it onto my wrist. Never forget who you were before someone told you who to be. For the first time in years, that sentence didn't feel like a reminder. It felt like a description. And as I turned away from the window, I knew something with absolute certainty. This chapter of my life was not about survival. It was about authorship. And I was finally holding the pen again. I didn't announce anything. I didn't post explanations. I didn't send messages clarifying my side. I didn't correct rumors or preempt questions. I simply stopped showing up where I used to stand beside Marcus. And slowly, the space I left behind began to speak for itself. At first, it was subtle. A friend who used to invite us as a pair started calling just me. A coworker asked carefully how I was doing, then listened longer than politeness required. Someone I barely knew mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Marcus seemed stressed lately. I nodded and said nothing. People are perceptive when they're finally allowed to be. Marcus tried once more to reclaim the narrative. I heard about it through someone else, how he framed himself as blindsided, how he painted me as unforgiving, how he emphasized how much he'd done for me. The story landed differently this time, because stories don't survive contact with reality forever. People remembered things, small comments, offhand jokes, moments that had once passed unnoticed, now rearranged themselves into a clearer picture. No one came to apologize for not defending me sooner. I didn't need them to. What mattered was that I no longer felt the need to explain myself into being believed. I stood firmer in meetings. I spoke more plainly. I declined invitations without guilt. I took up space without apology. And the strangest thing happened. People adjusted. They treated me with a steadiness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Not reverence, not pity, respect. One evening, sitting alone with a book and a cup of tea, I thought about how hard I'd once worked to be palatable, to be agreeable, to be grateful for love that demanded silence in return. I understood now why Marcus had chosen women like me, not because we were weak, but because we were capable, because we could carry weight quietly, because we believed in fairness even when it wasn't offered back. But capability, I had learned, is not an invitation to be used, and dignity does not require consensus. The world didn't need to fully understand my story for it to be true. I didn't need Marcus exposed for me to be free. I didn't need an audience. I needed alignment. As I turned off the lamp and prepared for sleep, I felt something settle into place, solid, unshakable. I was no longer reacting to who I had been in someone else's story. I was living inside my own, and that was enough. The first thing I noticed was how quiet my mornings had become. Not empty, intentional. I woke without bracing myself for someone else's mood. I moved through the apartment without anticipating interruption. The silence wasn't something to fill anymore. It was something to stand inside. I made tea and watched the steam rise, thinking about how many years I'd confused endurance with devotion. How often I'd told myself that staying calm meant staying strong. How rarely I'd asked what the calm was costing me. Outside, the day began like any other. Cars passing, neighbors heading out, life continuing without commentary. I liked that. I liked not being watched, not being evaluated, not being required to perform gratitude for love that demanded silence in return. I thought about the night at the restaurant, the laughter, the stillness I held like armor. I remembered how I'd sat there, composed, believing dignity meant absorbing the blow quietly. I hadn't known then that dignity could also mean walking away and refusing to explain. That version of me wasn't weak. She was waiting. I didn't leave my marriage with a victory speech or a parade of supporters. I left with documents, boundaries, and a clarity that didn't ask permission to exist. I learned how to read statements, how to say no without softening it, how to stop managing someone else's comfort at the expense of my own safety. Most importantly, I learned to trust myself again, not the anxious self that second-guessed every instinct, the grounded self, the one who noticed patterns, who listened when something felt wrong, who finally accepted that love should never require self-erasure. Some days were still heavy. Healing doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly in ordinary moments, cooking dinner without being interrupted, sleeping through the night, laughing without checking the room for approval. I built a life that fit me, not a performance, not a compromise, but a rhythm I could sustain. I didn't need to be believed by everyone. I didn't need Marcus exposed to feel vindicated. The truth had done its work already. It had returned me to myself. That afternoon, I sat by the window with my notebook open, sunlight warming the page. I didn't write much, just a few lines to remind myself what mattered. I choose peace over proof. I choose clarity over comfort. I choose myself. When I stood to leave, I caught my reflection again. Older, yes. Wiser, definitely. But more than anything, present. Aligned. Whole in a way I hadn't been when I was trying to be everything for someone else. At the door, I paused, not from fear, but from intention. I understood now that endings aren't always loud. Sometimes they're steady. Sometimes they're the moment you stop negotiating your worth. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. No audience, no applause, just a future that would not require me to disappear. If you recognized yourself in the silence, the endurance, the moment you realize this isn't love, don't look away. Tell the truth, even if only to yourself. Then take one step toward the life that fits you. What would you choose if you stopped asking for permission? Thank you for being here, and I wish you peace and warmth until we meet again in the next video. Please like this video and subscribe for more.